Perfection, Smerfection. So last Sunday, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, a group of us went to see the new Disney movie Inside Out 2. And we planned this activity kind of as part of our summer of love, because one of the big objectives of this summer is to boost each participant's love of self, love of ourselves. And you see, these Inside Out movies, they're fun. They're a fun and creative way to explain a person's inner life of emotions. And I don't know about you, but I have spent a lot of time throughout my life criticizing my emotional responses to different things. When my reaction to something is less than loving and happy and all that, I've somehow disappointed myself and disappointed the people around me, and that snowballs. And then I get into feelings of low self-esteem and self-doubt and unworthiness and withdrawal. Please tell me I'm not the only one, right? Okay, so, but with greater understanding of the universality of emotions, meaning everyone else is going through the same kinds of things, the same emotional reactions as I am, hopefully with greater understanding comes more self-compassion and self-acceptance, and also then hopefully more self-love. And at any rate, that was my intention when I included these movies in our Summer of Love. And I actually read some articles about the Pixar movie creators, and they were interviewed about the movie and creating it. And I also read some kind of viewer reactions to the movie. And the bottom line is the movie was intended to help people understand themselves more, especially in this latest one about how anxiety works. So for those of you who didn't go or don't understand the movies or haven't seen them, in the first movie, the main character, Riley, grapples with these core emotional experiences that we all have: anger and disgust and fear, sadness and joy. Those are the 5 primary emotions. But in the second movie, because she's crossed into adolescence, these new emotions were introduced. We know adolescence brings these emotions like envy and sarcasm and embarrassment and boredom, and the star of the show, which was anxiety. And as we were leaving the theater, I shared with a few people in the theater that this movie played wonderfully into the July theme of the whole Centers for Spiritual Living around the world are talking about perfection this summer. And as we explore perfectionism and the role that it plays in our overall spiritual and personal development, this movie was perfect for really looking at that. Because if you saw the movie with us or on your own, so Riley was newly in adolescence, and that really is typically the age when anxiety is first experienced, okay? So it makes sense because that's the age when, as kids, you're beginning to experience more and more of life situations away from your parents, away from people who are helping you. And kids have to get into situations where they're relying on their own strategies of how to get through things. And in the movie, Riley was at hockey camp, and she was at a training camp where she was torn between her old friends, her former childhood friends, with whom she felt really safe and secure and accepted. And then there were these more senior players at this training camp that she wanted to impress. And she wanted to kind of prove herself because she was going to get into high school. And so can anyone relate to that scenario? You're trying to, a long time ago, but we can relate to it, right? So anyway, Riley, she made some rookie mistakes, and she began questioning her worth. She began diving into fear and embarrassment, and shame began to swirl around her life like an overwhelming whirlwind of emotions bounded in anxiety. And anxiety pushes her to try to be more perfect to gain acceptance and favor. So there's inner push. And the movie showed how Riley eventually learned that every emotion had a purpose, and that all emotions were valuable, and not only her good emotions, that made her who she was, but her challenging emotions also were a part of who she was too. And in the movie, she kind of used her memories of successes and love to kind of rebalance herself so she could make better choices. But here's the deal. In the movie, what seemed to make a difference to her character recovering herself at the hockey camp was the presence in her life of loving and supportive parents and this solid foundation of friendships and also a foundation of personality development in a loving environment, good experiences and early successes to fall back on in her memory. But what happens when, like me, you don't have that? You don't have this loving, supportive environment in your early years. What if you have repressed your successful moments because they were never truly celebrated and acknowledged in your life, noticed? Can anybody relate to that, right? So without those kinds of support, anxiety and perfectionism can kind of take hold, and they can become these lifelong patterns of pain and confusion. So out of a scenario like that, when I was an adolescent, I developed an idea that if I could prove myself and be as good as possible, I would be likable and worthy. And basically I felt like I had to be perfect. I couldn't be, so that I couldn't be criticized, so that the adults around me wouldn't find any faults in me. Quite frankly, I had kind of given up on fitting in with my peers. I knew I couldn't be cool like them. The adults. Now that's a whole nother story, right? Adults rewarded perfection. So I strived to be perfect. I was a straight A student. I focused entirely on my academics to get good grades, and I focused on extracurricular kind of leadership activities so that I would be recognized, and I truly wanted to make teachers like me and gain positive adult attention outside of the trauma of my household. And this very young, unconscious strategy grew into my striving for perfection that was kind of hard to shake as I got into adulthood. And to make sure my own personal perfectionism journey wasn't just me, I started doing some reading about the topic to kind of get ready for this month of perfection as a theme. So I read this article it was actually written this year in April in Psychology Today. And this is what it said, and it's not a quote, Rebecca, don't panic. It says, perfectionism often stems from inner shame, especially in the aftermath of childhood trauma. Driven by a deep-seated belief of unworthiness or inadequacy, individuals may strive for perfection as a way to counteract or conceal their perceived flaws and vulnerabilities. This relentless pursuit of flawlessness becomes a coping mechanism to manage feelings of shame and self-doubt as individuals seek external validation and acceptance to quell their inner turmoil. However, perfectionism ultimately perpetuates a cycle of self-criticism and anxiety, reinforcing the underlying shame and preventing authentic self-acceptance. Recognizing perfectionism as a response to inner shame is crucial in fostering self-compassion and healing from past traumas. Take a deep breath. You know, that all makes sense. That paragraph couldn't have been closer to my truth. It could not have been. Throughout my 20s, I was striving to make the picture of my life flawless. I worked hard to make sure my home was beautiful because I needed the appearance of perfection. And to the outside world, my life probably did look pretty good, you know, but inside I was a mess. I was a mess. I was frantic to keep all the details of my world kind of swept up and in place. And let me be clear, there was no pressure from outside of me. There was no pressure outside of me to make myself perfect. That was inside of me. I was a great employee. I was rising into leadership within my company, not because I was perfect, but because the job was a good match from my skill set. But my perfectionism drove me to be the absolute best in my field, to win the top awards, to get the best promotions. But all of that came from inside of me. The social and professional environment around me was not giving me the message that I had to be perfect. But what if the pressure around you is telling you you have to be perfect? Terry and I were watching a Netflix documentary series about the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. Has anybody happened to see it? It's called America's Sweethearts. It's a wild thing. We started watching it. Again, I was getting ready for this July theme. I knew I was going to be talking about this topic. And here's this show about this extreme environment of perfectionism. In that world of elite dancing and cheerleading, the women are being judged about every single detail about their appearance and their personalities, and I mean every single detail. And the contenders, they're trying to get on the Dallas Cowboy cheerleader team. They're trying desperately to meet the standards so that they're not cut from the team. And again, while the show is a window into an extreme example of striving for perfection, you get to see, watching that show, the psychological toil that is happening inside the participants and the impact it's having on them, the emotional breakdowns, the self-esteem issues, the rampant anxiety, and the aftermath of this happens for decades later. The culture created within this organization is quite unrelatable to most of us. I couldn't relate to it, but to them, it just seemed acceptable and like this is just how it works. And they passed this culture along year after year after year. And each woman in the show had different ways of coping with this pressure of perfectionism. And this pressure was communicated constantly to them. And some of them coped by turning to their family members, like help me make this more reasonable. For support and reassurance. And some of them seemed to kind of distract themselves with work that they were doing during the day and other life endeavors rather than just cheering. And most of them clung to each other for reassurance about any perceived flaws that they had, and all with varying degrees of success, I might add, because most of them were absolutely visibly stressed. But the one woman that sparked my attention for obvious reasons was a woman named Reese. And she had a foundation of spirituality, actually. She had it going into the training camp, and she leaned on her faith. She was interviewed a lot. They all were. And she just had this self-love and this self-presence throughout the whole experience. And her mantras were similar to the ones that I teach y'all here. If this is for me, it will happen. I will make the team. And if not, I'm going to do something else. She just had this sense of it. She said, God is with me through all of this. Spirit is with me. And it was really interesting to watch her lean on her faith in that stress, because perfectionism is real. And if I just take those three examples I've just given you, Riley in Inside Out 2, who's a completely fictional but typical character, my own personal example of trauma kind of leading to perfectionism, and then the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders' extreme example of perfectionism, I can glean some wisdom. I can kind of piece this together for us spiritually. First of all, let us always remember that it is healthy to want to do our best. That's normal. It's normal to want to do our best, to develop our skills and our personal capabilities, doing whatever it is we're doing. It's normal to have goals and dreams and being at the top of our field, to arising to the highest level we can. That's all normal. That inner drive can actually be really good for us. And our human selves thrive on accomplishments and achievements. But it is time to take a second look at yourself, at what's going on when we find ourselves at either extreme of the spectrum of striving to be our best. So at one extreme is having the attitude of not caring, like it's impossible. I don't care about my performance. I'm not willing to engage. I'm not trying. I'm quitting. I'm not going to do it. And at this extreme, we've kind of given up, and we no longer want to engage in situations where we might be measured. Can anybody relate to that extreme? Like, I'm not even trying. And at the other end is this anxiety-driven perfectionism. And what does that show up as? Inflexibility and kind of robotic reactions, workaholism, all of that is down here at this extreme. And all of us can have short times in either of these extremes, but when we live there most of the time, we know that we've lost touch with our inner spirit, because that doesn't exist at either of those extremes. And by the time I found spirituality in my mid-30s, I had a hard time relaxing. I had a hard time. I truly felt that my self-worth was measured by how pretty my picture was. Again, my house had to be perfect. My daughter and I had to be dressed just so. I had to be at the top of my job performance all the time and win the awards. And I had this great anxiety around friendships and relationships because they involved controlling other people to participate in my picture of perfection, and often that was just impossible to achieve, right? But I found my path to freedom because spirituality helped me see myself and my primary identity as my soul. Because here in spirituality, I learned that I was already perfect, whole, and complete within myself. Here in spirituality, I learned that I could relax and know that everything that unfolded in my life was for me. And that what was meant to be mine, like Reese said, what was meant to be mine would be mine. And I learned the phrase, rejection is God's protection. Here in spirituality, I learned to measure myself by the amount of love and compassion and light and gratitude I could express into the world instead of how much I could achieve. Here in spirituality, I learned that creativity was one of my reasons for being here. And guess what? Perfectionism kills creativity. And here's why. Perfectionism assumes that there's only one way of being, one way of looking, one way of expressing that is acceptable. It involves a ton of self-judgment and then projecting that judgment onto other people so that we tell ourselves that they are also measuring us by this standard that we have within ourselves. In other words, perfectionism is a set of thoughts, and thoughts can be changed. And changing those thoughts frees us up to be creative and juicy and messy and unique. But guess what I realized about 18 months ago? About 18 months ago, somewhere in late 2022, I woke up to the reality that my lifelong habit of perfectionism had followed me into ministry. So my fresh opportunity for healing and growth was also following me. See, I had an idea of what a perfect Sunday should look like, feel like, how it should go, what everyone's part was, and how all the details would just be perfect, right? And as we went through our early years here of working together, I would get so stressed out if something went awry or something didn't turn out to be what I expected it to be. Because here's my false belief. I felt like the only way people would choose to come to CSLTB and choose it as their spiritual home was as if everything was just perfect. And I was scared to change things because my perfectionism made me want to stick to the tried and true. And it was such familiar ground for me because of my early perfectionism tendencies. So if you've been around here for a few years, and I know there are people back here that have, you may have noticed that something inside shifted for me in January of 2023 because on the first Sunday last year, I declared CSLTB to be a perfection-free zone. How many of you heard me say that? It's a perfection-free zone. And I meant it because my perfectionism was contagious. And others of you were needing things to be perfect too. So declaring it to be a perfection-free zone allowed the center to become a place of shared leadership, shared creativity, joyful participation, and freedom to try new things and change things. Declaring it to be a perfection-free zone took the pressure off me and everyone else. And since that day, the energy has shifted. You know why? Because perfectionism is grounded in fear. And we have now become a place founded in love and acceptance and gratitude for what shows up. Our collective self-esteem has risen. And as our collective self-worth has risen, we draw to us better and better experience. It's just how it works. So I invite you to examine your life for evidence of perfectionism and set yourself free through knowing a greater spiritual truth about yourself. And I have a few of them to share. Number one, you are a soul. You are a soul, already perfect because you have spirit living through you. You don't have to prove or improve on the spiritual level. Stand on that foundation of self-love and acceptance as you slowly allow your human ego self to just relax. Pry your human white-knuckled hands off the steering wheel and move out of the driver's seat so that your spiritual self can be on the forefront. Your soul knows that there's no perfection available on the human level anyway, and your soul is secure in its unique identity. Number two, life is about experiences that help us learn and grow and evolve. And the only way you learn, grow, and evolve is to try new things and push your limits. And when you try new things and push your limits, guess what happens? Things get messy and uncontrolled and certainly unpredictable, far from these standards of perfection. It's only through practice that things get better. Number three, self-acceptance has transformational power because it frees up your mind to receive new information and inspiration and ideas. And one of those new ideas is that everyone else gets to be imperfect too and still be lovable, because we're looking at them through the lens of compassion and understanding. We have to break the cycle and not pass perfectionism to other people. Richard Rohr said this in his book, Falling Upward. If you have forgiven yourself for being imperfect and failing, you can now do it for just about everyone else. If you have not done it for yourself, I'm afraid you will likely pass on your sadness, absurdity, judgment, and futility to others. It's contagious. Greater joy is possible right here and right now. Through embracing imperfection, we invite greater joy and creativity into our lives. So my invitation to each one of you today is to understand that life is full of ups and downs, challenges and setbacks. Imperfection is a natural part of the human experience. So reflect on how perfectionism may be hindering your personal growth. And maybe there's an area of your life where the pursuit of perfectionism has left you feeling stuck or paralyzed with fear and unworthiness. And take a moment to embrace those places and imagine what life might look like with greater compassion for yourself and authenticity might be available when you create a perfection-free zone. Because it is only in such a perfection-free zone that we can see the incredible possibilities that exist just beyond the edge of knowing how everything will unfold. And we can do that together. Allow your imperfect self to feel this shining light of acceptance and love that's always present, because there is no place where God is not. And in this room, let us shine our light of acceptance on every human who comes into our presence to learn and grow with us. So thank you for embracing my imperfections, and I vow to embrace yours too. Will you pray with me? Let's know this together. What I invite you to know with me this morning is that every single person is a God being, expressing the same source of life through everything that they do. And that as this perfect soul life energy passes through our humanity, sometimes it gets wonky. Sometimes it doesn't come out as the perfect idea behind the action. And so what I know is that there's enough room, there's enough grace, there's enough love to embrace all that we are and all that we give to the world. And I know that we are empowered by setting ourselves free from any idea of perfectionism. I'm thankful for this morning to share this idea, and I let it go and let it be. And so it is. So it is.